Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Views and News, and I'm Faisal Rahman live from our Islamabad studios. Today, we'll be talking about a very interesting subject, and that is primarily about the role of the United Nations. Generally, what we have witnessed over a period of time is that mostly those countries get benefited who are powerful, they have strong economies, strong militaries, and great ties with the Western world. So they can get away with anything and everything, whereas there are certain countries which suffer. So today we'll be talking about why United Nations is failing to resolve global disputes. That is going to be one of the major area of concern, and we'll also be talking about the expectation from the United Nations regarding Kashmir and Palestine disputes. We'll be also talking about why Islamophobia is rising in the world, because this is a very important issue earlier discussed by our Prime Minister in the previous UN meeting as well. And we'll be also talking about who's responsible for United Nations weakness, because the kind of expectation the world has from the United Nations body, unfortunately, there are certain disputes where there are problems. So we'll be primarily talking about these four important issues. And let me introduce you to our panelists. On my right is Syed Muhammad Ali. He's an expert on foreign affairs. Thank you very much, Ali, for your time. We have with us Ambassador Aslam Rizvi Saab, known a former diplomat. Thank you very much, sir, for your time as well. And on Skype, we'll be joined in by Imran Jan Saab, who's a senior columnist and a journalist. Thank you very much, Imran Jan, for your time as well. Now, let me put the first question straight away to you, Ali, and that is about why is United Nations failing to resolve the global disputes, primarily talking about the Palestinian and the Kashmir dispute, the oldest and still the kind of atrocities that are being committed out there by the other forces against the civilians, against the human rights, they are unfortunately miserable. And nobody is talking about them. We have raised this issue so many times, but still, all in vain, I would say. Your take, sir.
Thank you for choosing a very important topic, Faisal. I think there are basically four core reasons why United Nations is failing to live up to the expectations of the international community in general and the developing world in particular in addressing very critical and serious international issues. First is UN was founded at the ashes of the Second World War, with the hope that it will help address international issues and also maintain peace. But obviously, the first reason is that international order is in a flux, and the world order is undergoing a beginning to show signs of transformation. Secondly, I think we see an international trend of strategic realignments. Old alliances are becoming weak, if not collapsing, and there is the emergence of new possible realignments in East and West. That these two core reasons have affected the possibility of unilateralism has increased and multilateralism is on the retreat. So that makes it very difficult for any international body to come to a consensus and arrive at a solution on any important issue, be it Palestine, be it Kashmir, be it any other important issue. And lastly, there is a growing tendency, because of the growing polarization of major powers, a preference for unilateral actions. So these four reasons, when added up, have weakened UN and not addressed the issues and the expectations of the international community. And unfortunately, we are marking the 75th anniversary of UN's finding. It has helped promote and preserve, let me boldly say, the interests of the major powers, but there is a disproportionate lack of concern towards the interests and the concerns of the developing world. So the structural imbalance of power, which is inherent in the UN system, that the haves are sitting in the UN Security Councils, the have-nots who continue to voice their concerns every year in September in the UN General Assembly are sitting in the UN General Assembly. They get an opportunity to voice their concerns, condemn the oppressors, but that's just about it. There's rarely a moment in history when the developing world, which are essentially represented in the General Assembly, have been able to influence a consensus decision on any critical issue in the Security Council. Let me just lastly point out that we, as the Foreign Minister has also rightly pointed out, that it has practically become a debating forum.
Absolutely.
That's fine, but we need to zoom out and see that perhaps the most critical transformation in international system has not been through UN. While I was coming to your program, I was just reflecting. Pakistan was founded 2 years after UN came into existence. What was the role of UN in the creation of Pakistan? Did Quaid-e-Azam ever bother to engage UN that please intervene and bring independence to the Muslim population of South Asia? It was essentially the ability of the Muslim leadership of South Asia to convince the great power of that time, that was Britain. And a recent example is that, frankly speaking, is that of Iran. The US has failed to renew and continue the JCPOA related sanctions on Iran, and it has also failed to continue the sanction regime through a multilateral arrangement, although it has become essentially a unilateral approach. So there is not a complete lack of hope. I think the multilateralism has a future, but it has to be a patient, consistent exercise in which
and very time consuming.
And time consuming. It will not yield immediate results. So we need to be patient. We need to be consistent, and we need to reach out to all emerging, declining, or resurgent poles.
Absolutely.
So we should not just look at Washington.
Now, Ambassador Saab, couple of very good examples. For example, if you remember when Donald Trump took charge and he became the President of the United States of America, I mean, so many decisions were unilateral. I mean, they would not bother. P5+1, JCPOA issue. Everybody was on the same page. The moment the elections were won by Donald Trump, there was an absolute U-turn. Rest of the countries, whether it was Germany or Britain or China or Russia or France for that matter, they were on a different league altogether. Now, sir, the influence of one country, that is United States of America, they can veto and still they can get away, and they want to do whatever they want to do. Nobody can stop them, nobody can challenge them, nobody can oppose them. So what is the purpose of having United Nations? Let it be United States then.
Yes, that's very true. The fact remains that, over the 75 years, the UN, as pointed out by the Foreign Minister, was able to, make it more freer, more equal for the other nations, for decolonization, for the disarmament, So these certainly were very helpful moves made by that. But then again, there have been major failures as well, because two glaring examples, of course, being Palestine and Kashmir. On the other hand, we see that when it comes to the interest of the Western powers, and issues are not related to Muslim countries, for example, Sudan, the Christian part,
East Sudan and
East Timor, and we can quote some other examples. They were able to get movement and to have the
primarily because that was a dispute between the Muslims and the Christians, sir.
Christian, yes, because of the Islamophobia which is prevailing in the country right now. Now, the other thing is that the UN suffers from a very major problem. That is the restructuring of the Security Council. The veto power, 5 members of the community of 193 or 194 members of the UN, they enjoy a veto power, and they are not transparent, they are not democratic, they are not and effort for the last so many years to bring about a democratic, open, transparent. Change has not been possible so far.
All right.
And I think the President Erdogan in his speech in the parliament also pointed this out, that 5 countries in the world is much larger.
Absolutely.
There are 5 countries which are holding it hostage from there, and that importance that it should be restructured. Now,
So when we say restructure, what exactly is that supposed to mean? Adding more countries like India, for that matter, or maybe one of the Muslim countries, or a bloc or something of that sort?
There are 5 basic areas. One is the veto power, that in this day and age they should not.
UNSC, 5 countries.
5 countries. The second is the size. What should be the size of the United Nations Security Council? Number 3, the regional representation on that. And the 4th is the working of the council itself. And lastly and importantly, the relationship between the Security Council and General Assembly. So these are the 5 areas where they have to look into it. Now there have been various proposals, including the one about the expansion with the veto power, including for India and Brazil and Japan. And
From the Latin American side, there is nobody. From the Muslim world, there is no one.
Yes. So, but there has so far never been a consensus. Pakistan's proposal, which is joined by many countries, is what we call the unifying for consensus. That is intergovernmental. They should meet and have a consensus. No veto power. There should be no unilateral or voting to be done for this. And that is something which is going on for quite some time.
Ambassador, 2 examples. One is, if you remember, when the Americans, Donald Trump in particular, he took charge, he threatened the United Nations that he's going to cut the funding, right, sir? And that was regarding the issue of the
WHO.
Sir, this not WHO is recent one, sir. I'm talking about the Palestinian issue,
Yes.
where he said that, well, this is what we plan to do, this is how it is going to be done, and we don't care. Now, the new capital is the area which is disputed. I remember, sir, 8 small countries plus USA. These are the ones who actually supported this. Rest mostly abstained. Few went against it. Despite that, sir, they took the unilateral decision. You talk about the sanctions on Iran or Korea for that matter, sir. So many countries veto it. But still the Americans, I mean, even if they are the only ones who are supporting that, they'll go after that as well. So, I mean, don't you think this is totally something which is not acceptable?
I was just reading an interesting write-up. On the 9th of September, the General Assembly met to look into the political, economic, social consequences of the coronavirus and how to tackle this. And out of the 169 countries which attended, 2 of them oppose any cooperation to address this problem. Why? Because Cuba had made a proposal that there should be no unilateral interference in the economic, political, social areas in implementation of the coronavirus program that was being entitled, which is not in accordance with the legally and in accordance with international law. And these 2 countries, you guessed it, America and Israel. So here you see that even one of the pandemics, one of the great problems that we are facing in the country, in the world today, America and its protege Israel, they seem to think that they are the only ones who can call the shots, and nobody can do that. And also you can see that how it is not only just a political matter, but even when it comes to economic matters, health matters, the withdrawal from the WHO support by America, number 1. Number 2, in the UN, President Trump charging China for launching the China virus from there.
Even yesterday he was saying that, yeah.
And in contrast to that, look at the reaction from China itself, conciliatory. I said, we don't want a Cold War, we don't want even a hot
But I think
war.
so the Cold War has already started.
Yes. So what is
Whether we name it the trade war or whatever,
yes, yes.
the problem exists. So we've also been joined in by Imran Jan Saab. Imran Saab, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam, how are you?
Imran, I'm good. Thank you very much for taking out your time and talking to PTV World. Now, since we are talking about the role of United Nations and in particular countries like USA, I mean their influence is so much that the desired results are never there, especially for the weak countries, countries with with the kind of economy like Pakistan or maybe some African countries, Palestinian issue for that matter, Kashmir issue, so on and so forth. So it seems that Europeans are doing fine, the Americans are doing fine, but the Asians, they are not getting the right support by the United Nations Security Council for that matter. A lot of issues are vetoed by the Americans. And it seems that the entire global arena where you expect that sanity should prevail and at least things should be done on merit, that's not happening. Your take, sir?
So that is exactly why the United Nations was founded for in the first place. When the World War II happened, Europe was devastated, almost destroyed. The United States had about half of the world's wealth. That's when it was at its strongest and wealthiest point. And at that time, they asked a question, how do we control the world economically and politically? So for the economic part, they went ahead with World Bank. But for controlling the politics of the world, they created the United Nations. Previously, the League of Nations was it was a failure. The agenda that was advertised for the creation of the United Nations is to avoid having another war, just like the World War II, because now the world had very lethal weapons. The Soviet Union had become a nuclear power as well as the United States. So it was. I mean, if I'm not wrong, 70% of the bills of the United Nations are paid by the United States, just one country. So who's going to dictate to them? Of course, the United States. The UN could not prevent so many little and major wars the United States waged. The most famous example is the invasion of Iraq. It was based on completely false pretexts, based on complete lies. But the United Nations repeatedly said, don't do it, but it couldn't prevent that. Even though the same resolution that the United States and UK used to invade Iraq was also the resolution 9, UNSC resolution 987, that also obligates these countries to prevent Israelis from having a nuclear weapon. But nobody talks about that ever. So, I mean, that's exactly what it was designed for. If the United Nations, as Shah Mahmood Qureshi rightly said, it's a place where people come and talk, blow off their steam. That's what they do. Hugo Chavez famously used to come, Ahmadinejad used to come and just, say awful things, and in return they would get to hear the same things from other leaders. Talk is cheap, and UN is all about talk. And if it ever prosecutes some countries or leaders for some major war crimes, it's always a weak African nation which they go after. They never touch strong countries. So it will advocate democracies abroad. The United Nations is very undemocratic.
Imran, I'll just get back to you. You're breaking up. We'll just sort this issue out. Now, Ali, over to you now. When you talk about the United Nations role, primarily, sir, as you just mentioned, that the UN came into being after the Second World War. And this is the 75th year, almost 75 years, it's like 3/4 of a century. But sir, at that time, all those on one side versus the so-called axis of evil, they were on the other, whether you talk about Japan, Italy or Germany. They did very well after the World War in terms of economy and otherwise. But sir, all the allies, they ended up becoming the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. China, Russians, Americans, British and the French, all don't you think this is the time to balance it out, because the reality has changed, global dynamics have changed, global politics has changed, global players have changed. rise of China is a very, very prominent, I think, scenario for everyone. So there has to be a balance, because Americans end up putting a sanction on Iran, unilateral decision, everybody has to follow. You can't do trade with them. Okay, regarding Pakistan, Brown Amendment and so on and so forth, so many amendments in Pakistan, Korea for that matter. So what I'm saying is that this is like, as they say, this Urdu word, the jagga. So Americans have become the jagga of the world, right, sir? And that is very, very unfair.
Faisal, absolutely. I think it's an unfortunate but I mean a true reflection of power politics, which is realpolitik, which is amoral and devoid of any unfortunately humanitarian or esoteric considerations. You made two very important points. I think it is not a coincidence that the 5 victors of the Second World War preserved the right of veto for themselves exclusively and continue to jealously guard it and resist diplomatically all efforts to enlarge this group of 5 and in their individual self-interest, not just collective interest, although they are competing with each other in different domains right now. And secondly, a very popular scholar, a leading US scholar, Hans-Jan Morgenthau, he wrote a very famous book, Politics Among Nations. And in the chapter, he focused on United Nations, a very interesting title he gave, Government of Superpowers. He called UN the government of superpowers. The superpowers use this forum to legitimize the pursuit and protection of their interests exclusively. And in order to legitimize and allow the have-nots a debating forum where they can come annually and also express their concern and also pacify their public sentiment, that is what happens in UNG every year. You hear very vociferous, very candid, very critical speeches. But do these speeches actually influence the will of the great powers?
So you talk about Erdogan, you talk about the Koreans, you talk about the Cuban president Fidel Castro, you talk about Hugo Chavez from Venezuela.
Yes.
I mean, the kind of statements they have given, I remember.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, but nothing happened.
So the most important point, like you rightly pointed out, is that the power is not permanent. Its distribution is transforming. And the structure which is rooted in the outcome of the World War II 75 years ago is not representing the aspirations, the distribution, the concerns of the international community. So like Master Rizvi rightly pointed out, not only there has to be a mechanism, a peaceful multilateral negotiated mechanism for redistribution of power in a manner that this institution, in order to remain relevant and effective, is reflective of the aspirations and concerns of the entire international community, not just the haves and not just the global north, as they call. I was just reflecting on what you said. I think it's not a coincidence that all 5 permanent members of Security Council belong to the global north. There is not one permanent member which is from the global south. It is not a coincidence.
But that's the division, sir.
So the power essentially, let me say on your show, essentially has remained in that white Caucasian race. Why is it that? Why the blacks, why the Muslims, why the yellows, why the Africans, why the developing nation is not represented there? I think it's about time that these developing countries, perhaps mobilize themselves and put pressure on them, because like with the emergence of China and reassertion of Russia, we see a possibility, a realistic possibility, that perhaps in future some alternative institution could be considered. Because if this institution fails to address the concerns,
it has failed, sir,
and it fails to preserve peace. And also not just to preserve peace, but to prevent the powerful countries from
To invade.
exploiting, from invading, from unilaterally intervening in other countries.
Then, sir, when the Americans invaded Iraq,
Yes.
they went into Syria,
Yes.
they went after the
In Libya, yes.
Afghan, Libya,
Yes,
you name
yes,
it, sir.
yes.
Then you can always count the 2011 Arab Spring. I mean, where they had interest, like Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, nothing happened. But what about the rest of the country? Now, this is something very important.
Only my brief comment would be that although there are some modest specific achievements of United Nations, however, I think the failures outweigh the successes.
Sir, you agree with that,
Yes,
sir?
I totally agree. Just one last word regarding the restructuring of the Security Council. In the final thing, whatever the proposals, various proposals which are being put forward over the years, finally, the Security Council, the 5 members, they have to endorse it. And, in the self-interest, obviously, they are not going to go forward. That is one of the main reasons that it is not moving forward. America today remains the most powerful, economically the #1 country in the world, militarily, of course, very high. And it has, suffered very badly internationally because of the policies of President Trump. Because of that, I think there is now a realization to revert back to a more sensible policy, multilateralism, going back to the various cooperation, be it the environment, be it other areas of cooperation. And he's already said, Joe Biden, who is the likely next president, that he will revert back to the Paris Accord. He's also, as far as Muslims are concerned, he said he will stop the ban on them and so on. So we see that there is hope that there will be slight change occurring. But again, the American history, if we go back, they still have their biases, and they are, it will take a while before we can come to a situation where we can expect a even-handed approach by America.
Sir, I don't understand one thing, sir.
Yes.
And that is that China has a huge economy, number 2 at the moment. Americans have a huge economy. They have a lot of debt as well. It's around 19-20 trillion dollars. But sir, the problem is that when Americans come up and say, well, we are putting sanctions on XYZ country because they are still, for example, enriching their uranium, or for that matter, still working on the centrifuges and so on and so forth. They can do that. Why can't China or Russia do that? I mean, Americans have been putting sanctions on the Russian athletes, for that matter, on the Chinese trade. I mean, how can one country, do that kind of a damage to others, and countries like Russia or China, for that matter, sir?
Like I said, they are waiting, both. And China's policy has been no confrontation. They want to be cooperation, all-encompassing. That is their policy for me. And I think they are waiting to see what happens after the election, and you may see some more changes coming up. Now, I think the major problem right now, which the UN needs to take notice of more than anything else, is the rise of racism and Nazism. And we see this policy of nationalism and move to the right, which has been introduced by Trump, and what we see in India. The Second World War, we've gone from the ashes that we have built up the UN General Assembly and so on, the United Nations. But the cause, Hitler, what he introduced, what was the cause? That is, we see, is creeping up now. And it is important that, this matter should be addressed. One of the way out is, if the UN is not taking any action, and OIC, as we've seen also, is now, has been and become now more relevant as far as the Muslim issues are, Islamic issues are concerned. More recently with the, the Saudi Arabia into the Israeli camp and American camp and UAE, etc. perhaps I think we need to go and rethink about the proposal made by Malaysia and Turkey and Pakistan too for having another organization which can do something meaningful. One had hopes that when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia came, that he was going to create a counterpart of a NATO, a Muslim NATO, to address the Muslim problem and resolve that. It turned out to be a damn squib. I mean, nothing. We just had General Sharif.
Because the very
take
base
over.
of that argument, I would say, never existed, because primarily, sir, the disputes, it was in Yemen, the dispute was in Syria, the dispute was in Iraq, issues are in Iran. These countries were not even thought of, okay, that they could be a part of that deal actually, and they were ousted in a way. So it doesn't make any sense to me, sir.
Quite right.
That's the problem. So a lot of people also believe that if the primarily what they said was that if you take out the headquarters of OIC from Jeddah, it is going to be much more effective. But sir, one quick comment before I move on to our other guest. Do you believe, sir, that this, obviously Bahrain, earlier UAE, most likely Oman, because there was a visit of the Israeli Prime Minister there as well, and then Mr. Qaboos, if I'm not wrong, sir, he passed away as well. So his brother is looking after the affairs. So a new phase, a new start. Bahrain, when this issue started, immediately no Shia, no Sunni, nothing, it was taken care of, wherever the American interest is. So don't you think, sir, this is something which we should also realize, and at some stage we would see the kind of influence the Saudis or the Middle Eastern or the Gulf countries for that matter, which they earlier had, they will lose that edge.
I think your take is correct as far as that.
It might take 5, 10, 15 years, and also see, look, whatever is happening in Yemen, sir, nobody is reporting about it. Look at the misery. They don't have food, they don't have clean drinking water. We talk about Palestinian issue, we talk about Kashmir issue, though they are not on the main front line, they're not making the main headlines anymore. But sir, Yemen issue is not a joke. I mean, we hardly hear what's going on, but I'm sure it's terrible out there. Imran Jan Saab, I hope, sir, this time you can hear me clearly.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Perfectly fine. Thank you. Thank you, Imran. Now, Imran, let's throw light on this concept of Islamophobia that is rising in the world. Obviously, Muslims are being subject to so many hostilities, I would say. And at the same time, countries like Palestinians or issues in Kashmir, or in Uruguay issues, or for that matter, what happened in Myanmar. I mean, except for a few countries, nobody raised their voice. Turkey, Pakistan, Malaysia primarily. Iran, yes, of course. So, do you believe that, taking the right steps in the right direction at the right time would actually make OIC more effective, A? And this concept of Islamophobia that was also addressed by the Prime Minister in his previous speech last year in United Nations, where he had 3 major areas of, one was Islamophobia, one was environment, one was about Kashmir. Your take on that part, sir?
So the problem of Islamophobia had been there for a while, especially right after 9/11. It was at its peak. It is still there. What is really rising is the rise of ultra-right nationalism, the hatred for other people, people who are not like us, they don't look like us, they don't eat and dress up like us. That is increasing. That has been on the rise, and with the rise of Trump and a few European leaders and some movements in Europe, like in Germany even, that even what happened in New Zealand last year when the people were shot inside a masjid. So that has been on the rise. And that is quite a threatening thing. That threatens the very democratic system of those countries itself, rather than affecting the people who are immigrants in those countries. And I must add that, especially because of the pandemic and the rise of the coronavirus fear, people have forgotten about those previous villains, the Muslims and the black-skinned people or the brown-skinned people, people who look different. That has been for a while on the back burner now. But what is really, someone mentioned that that is a major threat. That is a major threat. what I would like to see the United Nations do, because I know it's not going to do anything about Kashmir or Palestine or Western Sahara for that moment, three regions that are under a military occupation right now. What I would like the UN to do is address the issue of climate change. I am really happy that a developing country like Pakistan, a leader of that country is talking about it. Even leaders of many rich countries don't even address this issue. They don't even talk about this issue because climate change is coming for all of us. Climate change can destroy this whole, it can cause our extinction. And so what is it that the United Nations is doing about that? That is a threat. And the threat of the nuclear war, that are the two major threats that we are facing right now. I want to add that the bulletin of the atomic scientists have moved their doomsday clock to 100 seconds before midnight, which is a metaphor. It means that's how close we are to destruction, complete destruction of this planet, everybody. And so that's the closest it has ever been moved. A book just came out by Bob Woodward. It's called Rage. It's mostly about Donald Trump and his interviews that he conducted with him. I was reading that book, and there's an interesting mention in one of the chapters about how the months of June and September in 2017 were the most dangerous months. Americans have no idea about that. Nobody knows. America and North Korea had come almost like very close to a nuclear war. It was about to happen. Buttons were just left to be pushed. They even sent missiles just to send a message. Even in the age of email, they were sending missiles to send messages. So they came very close to a nuclear war, but it was averted, thankfully. So I mean, United Nations, I was saying earlier when it wasn't very, my voice was cutting. That's how the United Nations was designed in the first place. It's an undemocratic system. The interests of the top strong countries are represented only. They have the power to veto. United Nations, if I'm not wrong, 70% of its bills are paid by the United States, just one country. So whose orders United Nations is supposed to follow? Of course, the United States. It could never stop US from invading so many different countries around the world. So to solve the issue of Kashmir and Palestine, that's too much to expect from them. The Muslim world is even in the US and the Israeli camp right now. The entire Arab
Nations
world
is
right
an
now.
absolute biased body, favoring a few and going after the rest.
That's if it ever prosecutes some country's leader for some war crimes, it is always some weak African country that the U.S. doesn't get along with. So they will always go after that country. So I mean, yes, Islamophobia is rising. Ultra right-wing nationalism is rising, and these are threatening things. But for as long as United Nations do not take care of the interests of all countries or the weaker countries, or the way it is designed only to allow strong countries with nuclear weapons. You talked about how those are white northern countries. Sure, they are, but those are also the countries with nuclear weapons. You know, Germany is not there. Canada is not there. Those are white and northern countries too. So,
Australia.
so nuclear weapon countries can dictate their interests, veto bills, and when it came to always talking about the rights of the Palestinian people, for example, two countries, especially one country, always vetoed that resolution. That was the United States. The same is going to happen with Kashmir, because India is now more of a U.S. ally than ever before. So I don't see the United Nations playing any role. And someone suggested in your show just now, rightly, that we shouldn't always just work through the system of the United Nations to achieve results. We can do it ourselves too. You know, Turkey and Malaysia created Kuala Lumpur Summit. So instead of OIC, we can become members there. We can start working through that system.
The Saudis
and
felt
that's
threatened. They thought maybe another organization is in making and their role would be diminished at some stage. They were very insecure. Correct?
That's exactly what it was, and that's why they pressured Pakistan not to attend. You know, they did not want the title of the leaders of the Muslim Ummah to be taken away from them, and that's
one quick comment from you. Since earlier I did ask the same question to Ambassador Rizvi Saab. Now, I want you to also comment on this issue. For example, if another, a bunch of Muslim countries, they form another XYZ organization and they can raise the real issues at an appropriate time in a great way so that they can get some sort of an influence there. You think that would be a workable solution, or you think these Gulf countries, G6 countries primarily, they would create a problem?
Anything with Gulf and Arab would be a problem, to make it very simple. If you have Arab countries in it, it would be a problem. It would be dysfunctional. It would only cater to the interests of the Western countries, primarily the United States. So, yeah, it would be very necessary to have such a body and work through that, address the real issues that are important to developing countries, countries like Pakistan, countries like Turkey, and even India, as I mentioned. Climate change. I know you didn't talk about climate change. You didn't ask me about that, but I do want to keep coming back to it. Climate change will affect India and Pakistan more than any other country. The story of climate change is no different than the United Nations, because climate is affected more by the rich countries, but the price would be paid more by the poor countries, the developing countries. If we achieve a 4-degree warming of the planet, $551 trillion would be lost from the world economy, world GDP, and 25% of that would be paid by India alone. So India needs to think about that also. And so that is a very threatening situation, and we are racing toward that scenario. And like I said, nobody's talking about it. United Nations is not going to talk about it, because the burning of the fossil fuels is what the United States is doing, and UN is not going to stand up to that. So some other group of countries need to do something about that and start talking about that. So it would be, yes, of course, very functional to have another body, and again, not have any Gulf countries and not have any Arab countries in it, unless they're just members and have no role to decide over issues. It could work then. Kuala Lumpur Summit is a good example. You have Malaysia, Turkey, Pakistan. These three leaders, Imran Khan, Erdogan, and the Malaysian leader, they're talking about real issues. They're talking about important issues, issues that are real to the average people, not to the Western corporate interests. So it is very, very important, yes.
All right. Now, Ali, there was a story in TRT World, and they said 12 times the United Nations has failed the world. So they have given all the accounts. Israeli occupation from 1948 till now, Kashmir dispute 1948 till now, Cambodia violence 75 to 79, then it says Somali civil war 91 till now, Rwandan civil war 1994, Srebrenica massacre 1995, Darfur conflict in Sudan 2003 till now, Iraqi invasion 2003 till 2011, Syrian civil war ever since the Arab Spring started till now, South Sudan issue 2013 till now, Yemen civil war 2014 till now, Rohingya crisis Myanmar 2017 till now, and there's a long list, by the way. So when you look at these issues, primarily either Muslim countries or third world countries or African nations, no issues in dispute in Europe or elsewhere.
Faisal, I'll just make 3 points. Number one, if you look at the record of United Nations Security Council, the country which has used the veto power more than any other country is United States. So what does that mean? That means again a diplomatic use of unilateral instrument of policy, not through working through a consensus building approach. It has used veto more than any other country, number one. Secondly, just to contextualize what you just mentioned, there are 4 major issues which the world faces, and unfortunately the record of United Nations is less than impressive on all 4 accounts. When we talk about political ideology, for the last 19 years, total excessive obsession with extremism in the Muslim world, but complete overlooking the rise of extremism and Islamophobia in the Western capitals. Today you see the rise of Islamophobia in the US, in Western Europe, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Netherlands, but the UN is silent on that. So that's one aspect. The second is lack of preventing violence, whether it is individual unilateral use of force by any superpower, any major power in a developing country, or preventing or encouraging disarmament. According to NPT, the 5 major powers have a obligation, a legal obligation to disarm from their nuclear weapons. They have not done that, and they are discouraging and sermonizing other countries to exercise restraint and all that. That is the second part. The third is lack of ability to timely and effectively counter disease. The recent example is COVID-19. UN is absent in terms of leading the world towards a multilateral approach towards dealing with this global health crisis. And the fourth issue is poverty. The distribution of wealth is also not fair. So when you look at the political ideology, you look at violence, you look at disease control, you look at fair and equitable distribution of wealth, I don't see an impressive record. So that makes UN very irrelevant. And with the passage of time, this will unfortunately lead to more unilateralism.
Speaking, I mean, that is the reason, sir. Our foreign minister said that this is just a place to go and talk and come back, and you know that nothing is going to happen. So, last 1 minute, your take, sir.
One has to become itself, a nation has to develop itself, it must mean something. Economically, politically, it should be relevant to the world. And look at the example of Israel itself. I mean, it gets away with murder, literally.
Yes, sir.
And only because it's strong, economically very strong and so on. So I think it is important for Pakistan in the Muslim world, like Turkey has, gone up. We should try and be more relevant to the world. We are gradually, our status, our clout has been reducing over the years for one reason.
That's correct, sir.
So this is my one point. Second point is, as far as Kashmir is concerned, United Nations has at least provided us resolutions. They have provided us means whereby we can help the Kashmiris. Colonization of the Kashmiris means that you have not only to give them political support, moral support, economic support, but also militarily you can give them support with the arms. Of course, I'm not advocating that we
But again,
do
sir,
that, but
that's again when the United Nations comes in,
ultimately,
because those freedom fighters would be considered terrorists.
Well,
see, that's the problem.
This is what I'm saying. Well, the narrative
All
has
right.
to change, and from that point onwards, we have to look at the long term.
All right, sir.
Human rights right now, later on, if make ourselves more, let our voice be heard internationally.
Let's see, sir. But this is a very, very complicated issue. Anyway, Ambassador Saab, it was a pleasure having you. Saeed Mohammad Ali, thank you so much. Imran Jan, was a pleasure to have you in our show as well. And that's all we have for this hour. I'll see you inshallah tomorrow. Till then, you take good care. Khuda Hafiz.